The following presentation is from PBS Home Video.
This is PBS.
Major funding for Eyes on the Prize is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, public television stations, the Ford Foundation, General Electric. At GE, we're in the business of trying to make life a little easier, a little better. At GE, we bring good things to life. Lotus Development Corporation, software that's changed the way people do business. The Charles H. Revson Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, Incorporated, and by the following. A complete list is available from PBS.
February 1st, 1960. In Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 black college students sat down at a lunch counter reserved for whites and refused to leave. This sit-in was a direct challenge to Southern tradition.
Well, it's just not the things we're used to down here. I mean, they come in and they sit down, and we're not used to them sitting down beside us, because I wasn't raised with them. I never have lived with them, and I'm not going to start now.
Trained in nonviolence, the students refused to fight back. As the sit-in spread, they threatened the established order in cities across the South.
I know the one thing we did right was the day we started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
I am Ben West, and this is my city. For the past 10 years, I have been its mayor. I have watched it grow from an overgrown country town into a great metropolitan complex. While Nashville is a city, yet the ways of its people are small townish. The morning greeting is commonplace.
And I'm moving on.
Nashville was proud of its progressive tradition. A center for education, the arts, and industry, it had long promoted itself as the Athens of the South. But for its 70,000 black residents, this was still the segregated South. Movies, hotels, and city buses were segregated. Blacks spent money in downtown stores, but were refused seats at lunch counters. In Nashville, a generation that had grown up with segregation was about to demand a change.
When I was a boy, of course, Nashville was clearly a divided town. We were very much aware of that. And yet, on the other hand, we really didn't care. We were very much contained. We knew our culture. We knew what we were about. But it was clear that when I was very young, that I had some problems asking my mother questions about why that was. I knew that it was, but I was always curious to why it was. And one day we were in Crest, and Crest had these beautiful marble fountains, water fountains, and one said colored and one said white. And being the kind of kid I was, I went over to both fountains and tasted the water and told my mother, "Tastes the same to me, Mom." So she said, "Boy, come on here." I said, "Well, Mother, what's the reason? Why are there 2 names up there and the water is exactly the same, Mom?" She said, "Boy, come on here. We ain't got time to fool around with that kind of mess." And I always thought, you know, that there was something in the back of her head that she wasn't giving me.
The best things in life are free, but you can give them to the
Nashville's 4 black colleges attracted young people from across the country. For many, segregation would be an unforgettable lesson.
I was looking forward in college to really expanding myself and growing. I was taking those kinds of issues very seriously. And that played quite a part when I got to Nashville, and why I so keenly resented segregation and not being allowed to do basic kinds of things like eating at restaurants, in the 10-cent stores, even. So I really felt stifled and shut in very unfairly.
The students were drawn to activist Jim Lawson and his workshops in nonviolent direct action.
Business to try to accomplish, and that is to try to have one major role-playing experience which sort of tries to set the stage for an actual demonstration, for an actual sit-in.
When Jim Lawson came to the city, he began to organize students, right? And most important to that for both students and we who were ministers was that we had workshops. And the workshops in nonviolence made the difference. We began to understand the philosophy behind it, the tactics, the techniques, how to, in fact, begin to take the blows and still respond with some sense of dignity.
Nigger! Nigger! Watch it! Hey, man, let's go!
Lawson's plan to confront segregation directly was a bold step. The first target for this direct action would be the lunch counters downtown. John Lewis, Angela Butler, and Diane Nash led students to Nashville's first sit-in.
The students were dressed like they were on the way to church. We went into the local stores. These stores were known all across the South, and for the most part, all across the country. We took our seats in a very orderly, peaceful fashion. We stayed there at the lunch counter studying and preparing our homework because we were denied service. The manager ordered that the lunch counters be closed, that the restaurants be closed. We just sit there, and we continue to sit all day long. The first day, nothing in terms of violence or any disorder, nothing happened.
The first sit-in we had was really funny because the waitresses were nervous. And they must have dropped $2,000 worth of dishes that day. So, I mean, literally, it was almost a cartoon because I can remember one in particular. She was so nervous. She picked up dishes, and she dropped one, and she'd pick up another one, and she'd drop it, and another. It was really funny, and we were sitting there trying not to laugh because we thought that laughing would be insulting, and we didn't want to create that kind of atmosphere. At the same time, we were scared to death.
Most people did not take the sit-ins too seriously at the beginning because they felt, well, these are the outside, these are agitators, these are students that have come from New York and other places, and they're not our Negroes. Our Negroes are happy, they're well off, and we know them. And we'd even sometimes ask, some of these people would ask their maid or something, and this was a joke, and the maid would say, oh, they're just, I don't pay no attention, no good trash. And then she'd leave and she'd go off to the NAACP meeting.
The sit-ins continued without incident for almost 2 weeks. Then, on February 27th, a warning. Gangs of toughs were gathering downtown. The students sat in as planned. The police did nothing to protect them. The students remained true to their training in nonviolence. When the police vans arrived, more than 80 demonstrators were arrested and charged with disorderly conduct.
The day that the police first arrested us, they announced to us, okay, all you niggers, get up from the lunch counter and, you know, or we're going to arrest you. And their attitude was like, well, we warned you. So they repeated it a couple of times and nobody moved. And of course we were prepared for this. So they said, well, we warned you, you won't move, okay, everybody's under arrest. And then they turned and they looked around at the lunch counter again, and the second wave of students had all taken seats. And they were confounded. They kind of looked at each other like, now what do we do, you know? And they said, well, okay, we'll arrest those two, and they did it. And then the third wave, and no matter what they did and how many they arrested, there was still a lunch counter full of students there.
Peace, quiet, and good order will be maintained in our city to the best of our ability. Riots, melees, and disturbances of the peace are against the interest of all our people, and therefore cannot be permitted.
Nashville's mayor, Ben West, was faced with more than maintaining public order. For generations, whites had taken for granted the second-class status of the city's black residents. Now, the students were forcing people to decide whether segregation was right or wrong.
I think that people who strive to gain social acceptance through although they're called nonviolent or passive resistance, they're the most violent. I also think that it is in violation to my civil rights. If someone can say, you must serve me, if a man owns an eating establishment, if he can't choose whom he pleases to serve or not to serve, that can affect me and you and anyone else.
Now, the people in the South have always fed people who came and knocked at the back door and asked for something to eat. But they have always reserved the right to eat only with invited guests.
The local black community began to unite behind the students. Black merchants supplied food to those in jail. Homeowners put up property for bail money. Z. Alexander Luby, the city's leading black lawyer, headed the defense. The court found the students guilty of disorderly conduct. John Lewis refused to pay the $50 fine. He chose 33 days in the city workhouse instead. Most of the other students joined him in jail.
Growing up in the rural South, it was not the thing to do, not to go to jail. It would bring shame and disgrace on the family. But for me, I tell you, it was like being involved in a holy crusade. It became a badge of honor.
Well, have you been to the jail, certainly? Well, have you been to the jail, certainly, Lord? Well, have you been to the jail, certainly, Lord? Certainly, certainly, certainly. Well, if they give you 30 days, certainly.
Parents worried that arrest records could hurt their children's future, and they feared for the safety of their children.
Well, there was plenty of anxiety on my part, but I always think of what Matthew Jr. told me. And when he called from the jail, he said, "Be cool, Mother." And that was very trying, and yet it was amusing too. He's telling me to be cool at this point. So even now, when I think of it, I get quite a bit of run out of it. Just hearing him say it, I can't say it as he said it, but he said, "Be cool, Mother." And I tried to be cool.
To fight the jailings of their children, parents turned to the power of their own pocketbooks. In Nashville, in 1960, Negro buying power was estimated at $50 million a year, with $10 million spent in the downtown stores alone.
Someone developed the idea of let's stop spending money downtown. And basically it was sort of like the Montgomery bus boycott. Let's stop supporting the system we're trying to change. The boycott in Nashville primarily focused on the Nashville downtown stores, the Nashville retail merchants. We figured that if they would feel the pinch of not having shoppers buy in the stores downtown Nashville, then that will put pressure on the mayor, on the political fabric of Nashville to change the rules and regulations.
We saw the Easter boycott as a chance to get over many ideas of nonviolence and help create a reconciliation of all the forces in the city. Easter was a most important time for buying. All blacks had to have a full, brand new outfit at Easter, no matter how poor you were, right? You may start 3 months ahead of time paying for that Easter outfit, and you may be paying for it for 3 months later.
Within 2 months, the sit-ins had spread to 69 cities, from Greensboro to San Antonio, and 2,000 had been arrested. To support the sit-in movement, a national boycott was organized. Those chain stores which discriminated in the South were also picketed in the North.
Do you think that the boycott has had any great impact on these national chains in a city like New York up to this time?
Well, I've already seen statements from some of the executive officers of both Cresses and Woolworth indicating that they're concerned that a decline has already been noted and is just beginning.
I take it then that you are advocating Negroes in New York to stay out of these national chain stores?
Oh, no, that's not true. I'm advocating that American citizens interested in democracy should stay out of chain stores.
The boycott was then perfect time to say, stay out of town. And Nashville as a whole, black and white, did stay out of town because the white folks wouldn't go downtown because of the potential violence, the riots as they saw it. The black folks, although there were some black folks who went to downtown to try and break the boycott, and we had to send some education committees downtown to convince them that that was not the thing to do. And we didn't hurt them, but we did kind of snatch their bags and tear things away from them, from their arms, and let them fall on the ground and say, stay out of town. And of course, that the word got around pretty quick, you don't go downtown anymore.
Within a month, the boycott by black customers was almost completely effective.
When it starts to hit your pocketbook, then you realize, hey, this is serious. The merchants are getting it from both sides. Then there was some violence. Blacks and some sympathetic whites were hit over the head by these blonde-headed hoods that seem to come out of the sewer for such occasions. And those who were standing in line in a movie or trying to get into a restaurant or a cafeteria, they were very hurt. And this created a fear so that then white people started to be afraid to come to shop too. And that was the main feeling I remember about those times, on fear.
It was not just student protesters who were attacked. Blacks who worked downtown also became targets of random violence. Nashville, the moderate southern city, looked on in disbelief. April 19th. Dynamite thrown from a passing car at 5:30 in the morning destroyed the home of Z. Alexander Luby, one of Nashville's black city councilmen and defense attorney for the arrested students. The blast was so powerful it shattered 147 windows in Meharry Medical College across the street. Miraculously, no one was killed.
It was such an outrageous act that it could be very useful to a nonviolent movement then to move, okay? It was a uniting of the city, but the outcome would be decided by how we in fact channel that energy, right? And we then had the first major march of the movement. People began to gather And we began to march, and students came out from the lunchrooms, and they came out from being on the campus grounds, and they joined, and they came out of buildings and dormitories. We filled Jefferson Avenue. It's a long, long way down Jefferson. After a while, there was a certain bit of singing, and as we came closer to town, it was merely the silence of the feet. One of the things that stood out in my mind as we walked by a place where there were workers out for the noon hour, white workers, and they had never seen anything like this. And here was all of 4,000 people marching down the street, and all you could hear was their feet as we silently moved. And they didn't know what to do, and they moved back up against the wall, and they simply stood against the wall, just looking. There was a fear there. There was an awe and they did not know what to do, but they knew that this was not to be stopped, this was not to be played with or to be joked with.
Racial issues now threatened to tear the city apart. Face to face on the steps of City Hall, Reverend C.T. Vivian condemned the mayor for his failure to speak out in the past. Diane Nash pushed Ben West to take a personal stand.
And we needed him to say integrate the counters, or to tell Nashville to do what Nashville knows it should have done a long time ago, like about 95 years ago after the Civil War. So I asked the mayor, first of all, Mayor West, do you feel that it's wrong to discriminate against a person solely on the basis of his race or color?
They asked me some pretty soul-searching questions. And one that was addressed to me as a man, and I tried as best I could to answer it, frankly and honestly, that I could not agree that it was morally right for someone to sell them merchandise and refuse them service. And I had to answer it just exactly that way. Of course, I received considerable criticism for it, but had I to answer it again, I would answer it in the same way again, because it was a moral question and was one that a man has to answer and not a politician.
I have a lot of respect for the way he responded. He didn't have to respond the way he did. He said that he felt like it was wrong for citizens of Nashville to be discriminated against at the lunch counters solely on the basis of the color of their skin. And I think that was the turning point.
3 weeks after Ben West's statement on the steps of City Hall, black customers were served for the first time at lunch counters in downtown stores. Supported by the black community, Nashville's college and high school students had demonstrated their ability to move out in front of the civil rights movement. The next big step in the growth of the student movement would be the formation of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In the spring of 1960, more than 200 veterans of the sit-in movement from Nashville and from other cities around the country attended an organizing conference in Raleigh, North Carolina. On April 15th, the students met under the sponsorship of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But SCLC's Ella Baker advised the students to stay independent of adult organizations.
Ella Baker was very important, giving direction to the student movement. And not giving direction in a way of her making decisions as to what the students ought to do, but in terms of really seeing how important it was to recognize the fact that the students should set the goals and directions and maintain control of the student movement.
SNCC was based on a new optimism. a feeling that youth could be a real force for change in the 1960s.
Everyone is voting for Jack, 'cause he's got what all the rest lack. Everyone wants to back Jack. Jack is on the right track, 'cause he's got...
The hard-fought presidential campaign of 1960. John Kennedy and Richard Nixon did not differ much in their moderate support for civil rights. Both candidates also looked to the white South for votes. But civil rights did become a campaign issue when Martin Luther King was arrested at a student sit-in in Atlanta. King, sentenced to 4 months hard labor, enraged the black community. Kennedy and Nixon were still wary of losing Southern white votes and avoided making public statements. But privately, Kennedy and his staff felt they had to take action.
There's Martin Luther King sitting in a county jail, and Kennedy wanted to do something, to say something. Finally, some of us had the idea that Kennedy might just call Mrs. King and express his sympathy and tell her what he was doing to get King out of jail.
He said, "I'm thinking about you and your husband, and I know this must be very difficult for you. If there's anything I can do to be of help, I want you to please feel free to call on me." And I didn't quite know what to say except to thank him and say, "Well, I really appreciate this. And if there is anything that you can do, I would deeply appreciate it."
And then that very night, Robert Kennedy called the judge in Georgia and called him to get that judge to get King out of jail.
The Kennedy phone calls proved to be a smart political move. The next day, King was released on bail. On the Sunday before Election Day, black ministers around the country endorsed Kennedy from their pulpits. It was to be one of the closest elections in American history, with John Kennedy winning by less than 2/3 of 1% of the popular vote.
Many of us felt that Kennedy's commitment to civil rights was political, that it was a device to get him elected, because in the first 6 to 8 months he had done very little. Let me illustrate that. During the campaign, he had indicated that there was one whole area of discrimination that the president could wipe out with merely a stroke of the pen, and that was the area of public housing discrimination. And if elected, he would use that stroke of the pen by issuing an executive order that would do the job. Well, we waited for more than a year for that stroke of the pen, then decided that his pen must have run dry.
The Congress of Racial Equality was determined to keep the pressure on Kennedy. CORE wanted the president to enforce 2 Supreme Court decisions banning segregated interstate travel. These Supreme Court decisions had been largely ignored throughout the South. In 1961, blacks were still forced to ride in the back of the bus and were shut out of the white-only waiting rooms. The administration had the power to force the southern states to obey the law through the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. CORE dramatized the need for the government to use that power with a tactic called the Freedom Rides.
We decided the way to do it was to have a group, an interracial group, ride through the South. This was not civil disobedience, really, because we would be doing merely what the Supreme Court said we had a right to do. The whites in the group would sit in the back of the bus, the blacks would sit in the front of the bus, and would refuse to move when ordered. At every rest stop, the whites would go into the waiting room for blacks, and the blacks into the waiting room for whites, and would seek to use all the facilities, refusing to leave. And we felt that we could then count upon the racists of the South to create a crisis so that the federal government would be compelled to enforce federal law. And that was the rationale for the Freedom Ride.
The Freedom Riders would board 2 buses in Washington, D.C. on May 4th. Their itinerary would take them through the Deep South and on to New Orleans by May 17th.
I believe the Freedom Ride started in the first week in May 1961 in Washington, D.C. As a matter of fact, On the night of May 3rd, 1961, this group of 13 Freedom Riders, 7 whites and 6 black, had a dinner at a Chinese restaurant in Washington, D.C. It was my first time having Chinese food. You know, someone growing up in the South and going to school in Nashville never had Chinese food. And this meal was like to me, it was like the Last Supper because you didn't know what to expect going on the Freedom Ride.
The riders encountered only minor resistance as they traveled through the Upper South. On Mother's Day, May 14th, 2 buses left Atlanta for Birmingham. Outside of Anniston, a mob firebombed the lead bus and blocked the exits. Twelve riders were hospitalized. The bus was destroyed. The second bus was met in Birmingham by a mob of Klansmen. Freedom Rider Jim Peck took the brunt of the beating.
This is Robert Chackney in Birmingham, at the home of a Negro clergyman. And with me are part of a group calling themselves the Freedom Riders, an interracial group traveling through the Deep South to challenge some of the segregated bus facilities in this part of the country. Yesterday they ran into trouble. They ran into violence. Today they say they intend to keep up their pilgrimage. Mr. Peck, you obviously have been injured. You're wearing bandages. What happened to you?
I got beaten twice yesterday by hoodlums, once aboard the bus and once in the terminal in Birmingham.
We can't act as nursemaids to agitators. I think when they learn that when they go somewhere to create a riot, that there's not going to be somebody there to stand between them and the other crowd, they'll stay home. That's been my experience with this type of individual. You see, they're always seeking the help of the police to protect them, but they are the first to criticize the police when the police are unable to protect them. And you just can't guarantee the safety of a fool, and that's what these folks are, just fools.
We had hoped that there would be protection. Indeed, that was one of the reasons that I sent a letter to the FBI. We had thought that the FBI would provide protection for us, would see to it at each stop that we were not brutalized or killed. But that did not happen.
The FBI had information, it turns out, that was quite specific about what was going to happen in Birmingham. They might have had similar information about what was going to happen in Anniston, but I'm not sure of that. But they clearly had advance information from Klan sources that the Freedom Riders were going to be attacked in the bus station at Birmingham, and that the Birmingham police were going to absent themselves and not do anything to protect the riders. The Bureau knew that. The Bureau didn't pass that information along to anybody in any other part of the department.
Corps riders boarded a plane to New Orleans after bus drivers refused to take them any further. It appeared the Freedom Ride was over. But the SNCC students from Nashville decided the ride must continue.
You know, if the Freedom Ride had been stopped as a result of violence, I strongly felt that the future of the movement was going to be just cut short, because the impression would have been given that whenever a movement starts, all that has to be done is that you attack it with massive violence, and the blacks would stop.
It was at that point, after the SNCC students from Nashville went into Birmingham, that Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, became really involved in it. Drivers walked off the job and would not drive the bus. And Kennedy got on the phone and called down to the bus terminal demanding that they find a driver. "Where is Mr. Greyhound?" he stormed. "Can't he drive a bus?"
Robert Kennedy started calling me on the telephone. Robert started calling the president of the Greyhound Bus Company, making demands on them. They had trouble getting drivers to drive the buses because they were concerned about their buses and themselves, I guess. But finally, every time I would talk to Robert, I would immediately read in the paper or hear on the wire service quotes from his office and from the White House saying that I said certain things. And many times it would be things that I did not say.
When Patterson refused to talk further, Kennedy sent Special Assistant John Siegenthaler to Alabama.
Finally, Governor Patterson did agree to a meeting, and I went down from Birmingham to Montgomery to meet with him. Went into that antebellum building that is the state capitol there. He had me into his office, had his whole cabinet seated around this great conference table.
Robert was insisting on a guarantee from us that none of them would be bothered or none of them would be injured. And of course, you couldn't give a guarantee like that for people who are not going to do what you say, are not going to obey the police, who are out looking for difficulty and trouble.
My duty as a federal officer was to inform him that if the state could not protect citizens of the United States, either in the cities or on the highways, that it was a federal responsibility and that we were prepared to assert it, but that we hoped we would not have to. He said he was not sure that safe conduct to be given to these agitators, as he called them. Floyd Mann then broke in and said, "Governor, as your chief law enforcement officer, I assure you, if you give me the responsibility, I can protect them." That was the first breakthrough.
I was really impressed with Mr. Siegenthaler's seemingly sincere efforts to resolve this matter. And he pushed real hard to get an answer about could the governor guarantee the safety of these people. The governor was just as adamant not to give that commitment. So at that point in time, I certainly felt that by having been appointed by the governor, that I certainly should assure them at that time that I felt that law and order could prevail in Alabama.
May 20th, the new contingent of 21 Freedom Riders received word that Alabama would protect them.
8:30 Saturday morning, we understood that an arrangement had been worked out where between the Justice Department and the officials of Greyhound and the officials of the state of Alabama, where we would board the bus with other customers or passioners, and there would be 2 officials of Greyhound. A private plane would fly over the bus. There would be a state patrol car every 15 or 20 miles along the highway between Birmingham and Montgomery, about 90 miles. We got on the bus, and a great many of the riders really literally took a nap. They went to sleep. I took a seat on the front seat right behind the driver with a young man by the name of Jim Spur, a young white guy. I was a spokesman for this particular group of riders. And we did see the plane, but I would say about 40 miles or less from the city of Montgomery, all sign of protection disappeared. There was no plane, no patrol car. And when we arrived at the bus station, it was just an eerie, just a strange feeling. It was so quiet, so peaceful, nothing.
And then all of a sudden, just like whoosh, magic, white people, sticks and bricks, nigger, kill the niggers. we were still on the bus, you know. But I think we all kind of decided, well, maybe we should go off the back of this bus, because we kind of knew that if we had gone off the back of the bus, that maybe they wouldn't be so bad on us. They wanted us to go off the back of the bus. And we decided, no, we'll go off the front and take what's coming to us. We went off the front of the bus. Jim Swery was a white fellow from Madison, Wisconsin. He had a lot of nerve. And I think that's what saved me, Bernard Lafayette, Alan Kaysen, because Jim Swery walked off the bus in front of us. And they were so, it was like they were possessed, because they couldn't believe that there was a white man who would help us. And they grabbed him and pulled him into the mob. I mean, it was a mob. When we came off the bus, they were so, their attention was on him. It's like they didn't see the rest of us. For like about maybe 30 seconds, they didn't see us. They didn't see us at all. And we were hemmed up by this rail. There's a rail right there at the bus station. Parking lot down below, cars down there. And then when they did turn toward us, we had a choice, about 10 or 15 feet below. We could stand there and take it, or we could go over the rail. Over the rail we went, me and Bernard Lafayette. Alan Kaysen always carried his little typewriter, always had his typewriter. Over the rail he went, on top of a car, hit the ground, took off, ran into the back of this building. It was the post office, and the people were in there carrying on the business of just like nothing was happening outside. But when we came through that, and our mail went to flying everywhere because we were running.
As I drove along, I saw two young women who were Freedom Riders being pummeled to one side. There was a woman who was walking along behind one of these young women. She had a purse on a strap, and she was beating her over the head. And a young, skinny, blonde teenager in a T-shirt was sort of dancing her backward in front of her, punching her in the face. Instinctively, I just bumped up onto the sidewalk, blew the horn, jumped out of the car, came around, grabbed the one who was being hit, took her back to the car. The other young woman got in the back seat of the car, and I opened the door, pushed this young woman, whose name I think was Susan Wilbur, and said, "Get in the car." And she said, "Mister, this is not your fight. I'm nonviolent. Don't get hurt because of me." I almost got away with it. If she'd gotten into the car, I think I could have gotten away. But that moment of hesitation gave the mob a chance to collect their wits. And one grabbed me by the arm, wheeled me around, and said, "What the hell are you doing?" And I said, "Get back, I'm a federal man," turned back to her, and the lights went out. I was hit with a pipe over this ear.
We heard the news about Jim Swery, about John Lewis, about William Barbee. William Barbee was damaged for life, really. Jim Swery for life. It's amazing that they're still living. They could have been killed.
Segregation must be stopped. It must be broken down. Those of us who are on the Freedom Ride, who will continue the Freedom Ride, I'm not sure that I'll be able to, but we're going on to New Orleans, no matter what happens. We're dedicated to this. We'll take hitting, we'll take beating. We're willing to accept death. But we're going to keep coming until we can ride from anywhere in the South to any place else in the South without anybody making any comments, just as American citizens.
Despite Floyd Mann's personal efforts, Montgomery police did not protect the riders. Robert Kennedy now ordered United States Marshals into Maxwell Air Force Base outside Montgomery.
As soon as the federal government is shown that by action that the state of Alabama can deal with law enforcement on their own, the U.S. Marshals will be out of there.
And I think that the federal government's position has been one which has encouraged these outside agitators to come into our state. And this encouragement has helped create the problem that we've got here. Now the federal government comes in here and illegally interferes in a domestic state matter, in a matter which they themselves have helped create.
That weekend, while 600 marshals took their positions, Martin Luther King flew in to lead a rally at the First Baptist Church. Sunday night, most of the leadership of the civil rights movement gathered in support of the Freedom Riders. On the streets, an angry mob surrounded the church, threatening all those inside.
We've had an ugly mob outside. They have injured some of the federal marshals. They burned some automobiles. But we are not giving in for what we are standing for. And maybe it takes something like this for the federal government to see that Alabama is not going to place any limit upon itself. It must be imposed from without.
King telephoned Robert Kennedy to report on the escalating violence. Kennedy called Governor Patterson demanding protection. The governor replied that he could not guarantee the safety of Martin Luther King. Tear gas from the battle outside began seeping into the church.
The first thing that we must do here tonight is to decide that we aren't going to become panicky. That's right. That we're going to be calm, and that we are going to continue to stand up for what we know is right, and that Alabama will have to face the fact that we are determined to be free. The main thing I want to say to you is fear not. That's right. We've gone too far to turn back. That's right. Let us be calm. We are together. We are not afraid. Amen. And we shall overcome. That's right. So just wait 1 minute. It is a sin and a shame before God in a day like this that these people who govern us would let things come to such a sad state. But God is not dead. The most guilty man in this state tonight is Governor John Patterson.
At 2 a.m., with the outnumbered federal marshals barely holding the line, Governor Patterson declared martial law and ordered in state police and the Alabama National Guard. The Kennedys had not been forced to send in an invading federal army. These troops were Alabama's own. The people in the First Baptist Church were safe. It had all happened quickly. In little more than 2 weeks since the rides began, the federal government, and now the state of Alabama, had been forced to protect the constitutional rights of the Freedom Riders. Montgomery, May 24th. Just 2 days after the siege at the First Baptist Church, Alabama Guardsmen were deployed around the Montgomery bus terminal to protect 27 Freedom Riders leaving on 2 buses for Jackson, Mississippi.
That ride from Montgomery to Jackson was like a military operation. Now, as we rode on the bus, there were Alabama National Guardsmen on the bus with us, about 6 of them, with bayonets fixed on their rifles. There were helicopters chopping around overhead. There were police cars screaming up and down the highway with their sirens blaring. We got to the border between Alabama and Mississippi and saw that famous sign, "Welcome to the Magnolia State." And our hearts jumped into our mouths. And there were Mississippi National Guardsmen flanking the highway at this point, with their guns pointed toward the forests on both sides of the road. And the bus proceeded on into the environs of Jackson and then Jackson. Now, as we got to the suburbs of Jackson, one of the Freedom Riders broke into song. And this was as it had to be. I can't sing, I wish I could, but his words went something like this. I'm taking a ride on the Greyhound bus line. I'm a-riding the front seat to Jackson this time. Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling. Hallelujah, ain't it fine? Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling down Freedom's main line.
I was read in the news, the Supreme Court had said, listen here, Mr. Jim Crow, it's time you were dead. Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling. Hallelujah, ain't it fine? Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling down Freedom's main line. I'm taking a ride on the Greyhound bus line. I'm riding the front seat to Jackson this time. Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling. Hallelujah, ain't it fine? Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling down Freedom's main line.
In Jackson, there was only police. Outside the terminal, inside the terminal. As we walked through, the police just said, keep moving. They let us go through the white side. We never got to stop, you know. They just said, keep moving. And they passed us right on through the white terminal into the paddy wagon and into jail. There was no violence in Mississippi.
Attorney General Robert Kennedy had made a deal with Mississippi authorities. He would not enforce the Supreme Court decision giving the riders the right to use any public area in the bus station. In return, Mississippi would make sure there was no violence. Kennedy avoided bloodshed, but by giving in to Mississippi's segregation laws, he put the Freedom Riders at the mercy of the local police and local judges.
The next day after we were arrested in Jackson, we went to court. Prosecutor got up, accused us of trespassing, took his seat. Our attorney, Jack Young, got up to defend us as human beings having the right to be treated like human beings. While he was defending us, the judge turned his back, looked at the wall. When he finished, the judge turned around, bam, 60 days in the state penitentiary. And there we were, on the way to Parchman. Maximum security.
After the first arrest on May 24, 1961, Freedom Riders continued to pour into Jackson. By summer's end, 300 had been arrested and sentenced.
You're under arrest. Get your name.
That same summer, Robert Kennedy petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission to issue regulations banning segregation in interstate travel. In late September, the commission complied. The students had won their victory, and they had become a major force in America's civil rights movement, experienced in direct action and its consequences.
In the penitentiary, Parchman, we were only allowed one book. That was the Bible. So we did a lot of singing, praying too, but a lot of singing. And those folks just couldn't understand how we could be happy singing. So they would say, shut up, shut up. And the women, we could hear the women on the other side, they sing to us and we sing to them. So they came through and said, well, if you don't shut up, we'll take your mattresses. That didn't bother us, we kept singing. So they came through, they took our mattresses. I let my mattress go, everybody let their mattress go. Next night they gave us our mattresses back. So we started singing again. They threatened us again. We will take your mattresses and you have to sleep on that steel without a mattress. and that still was cold, and you only had a pair of shorts and a little T-shirt on. We kept singing freedom songs. Freedom's coming and it won't be long. They came through the cell block. Stokely Carmichael was my cellmate. I told Stokely, I'm not letting my mattress go. Everybody peacefully let their mattress go. But I remember the night before when I had to sleep on that steel. So they came in to take my mattress. I was holding my mattress. They drug me out into the cell block. I still had my mattress. I wouldn't turn it loose. And one of the inmates, they would use the black inmates to come and get our mattresses. I mean the inmates, you know. And there was this guy, Pee Wee, they called him. Short, muscular. Oh. They said, Pee Wee, get him. Pee Wee came down on my head, man. Whoa, whoa. He was crying. Pee Wee was crying. I still have my mattress. That's when you remember when your parents used to whip you and say, it's gonna hurt me more than it hurt you? It hurt Pee Wee more than it hurt me.
I don't think any white person can really understand what it is to be a Negro in America.
There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights.
We didn't want to be forced into doing something. And this is, in one sense, is what it was. We were intimidated, we were threatened.
Segregationists learned to beat the civil rights movement at its own game. The movement leaders had to find new ways to fight back, but it was still no easy walk.
I know the one thing we did right was the day we started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
On January 14, 1963, these words made Alabama Governor George Wallace the symbol of Southern resistance. That year, movement leaders targeted the largest city in his state for a major civil rights confrontation, Birmingham, Alabama, a city that had attracted national attention for its strict segregation and racial hatred. A city that some call Bombingham because of the many bomb attacks against blacks.
Jesus, hold my hand.
For years, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and others had fought the segregated system. In 1956, Shuttlesworth demanded the desegregation of city buses. Many of his friends tried to talk him out of it.
They said we ought to stop and think this thing out. I said there's nothing to think out. We say we're going to ride, and we ride. We do what we say for a change. So we rode the buses, and over 250 people got arrested, I guess, and joined desegregated riding.
Because of his efforts, his house and church were bombed as he slept.
It blew the floor out from under my bed, space of, I guess, 15 feet. The springs that I was lying on, we never found them. I walked out from this. Instead of running away from the blast, running away from the Klansmen, I said to the Klansman police that came, he said, Reverend, if I were you, I'd get out of town fast as I could. I said, officer, you are not me. You go back and tell your Klan brethren that if God could keep me through this, then I'm here for the duration. I think that's what gave people the feeling that I wouldn't run, I didn't run, and that God had to be there.
In September of 1957, Shuttlesworth was attacked again as he tried to enroll his children in an all-white school. This kind of violence was not stopped by city officials. The most famous was Commissioner of Public Safety, Theophilus Eugene Connor, Bull Connor, whose opinions earned him election to 6 terms.
The so-called Negro movement is a part of the attempted takeover of our country by the lazy, the indolent, the beatniks, the ignorant, and by some misguided, religionist, and bleeding hearts, and all being led by the politicians who stay in office by appealing, remember, not to reason, but to the most votes.
Public sentiment turned against Connor in 1961 when the Freedom Riders were attacked in Birmingham on Mother's Day. Connor was linked to the Klan violence, and the local newspaper demanded to know where his police had been. The incident attracted national attention, and the city was embarrassed into taking action.
Something had to be changed. The business community, when they had supported Bull Connor for election, they really hadn't intended for him to do things like allowing things like the bus station to occur.
It was too late for an easy change. Birmingham was on a collision course with the national civil rights movement, and movement leaders were ready. They had just learned some hard lessons in a small city in southwest Georgia, Albany. Here, Martin Luther King suffered what some have called one of his greatest defeats. The Albany campaign started in 1961. Young organizers from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, came here to help the black community organize against segregation. In November, a federal agency ordered the desegregation of all facilities used for interstate travel. SNCC Representative Charles Sherrod sent students into the Trailways bus station to see if local authorities would arrest them.
Some of us really didn't think they would get arrested because this was a federal mandate. They mess with us now, but they were going to get the federal government on them, you know. Nobody was going to mess with the federal government, we thought.
But the students were arrested. Sherrod and SNCC continued to work with the community, finding it rewarding because of a special quality they found in the people of Albany.
If you have a gold mine, then there's a point in the gold mine where you have the richest part. And that's called the mother lode. That's what Albany is to black people, in terms of just the concentrated essence of the spirit of the people. And if you can imagine black people at our most powerful point in terms of community and peoplehood, then that's Albany, Georgia.
The black community attacked segregation wherever it existed. Demonstrations took place throughout the city, at libraries, schools, movie theaters, and City Hall.
And we just push pressure. Now, sometimes we don't know who controls this, who controls the other. So we stomp around and stomp and see whose feet we get. And then somebody's going to holler, oh, you got me. So then when he hollers, that's the direction we go in. And that was the general strategy. We didn't know what we were doing.
You want to know what the Negro in Albany is going to do? He's going to do whatever is necessary to ensure his freedom.
Dr. William G. Anderson was president of the Albany Movement, an umbrella organization formed to coordinate all the civil rights groups in the community. By mid-December, Dr. Anderson became concerned because more than 500 demonstrators had been jailed.
These were common, ordinary, everyday people, housewives, cooks, maids, laborers, children out of school. We had made no provisions for these people going to jail because we did not anticipate the mass arrest. So we concluded that night that we are into something that really we need some expert help in.
Dr. Anderson invited Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. to help in Albany. King brought with him the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a civil rights organization based in black churches and led by ministers.
They had asked Martin to come down just to make a speech, and he went only to make a speech.
So Dr. King, right, he came there with not even an overnight bag or a toothbrush, responded to my call. And I do not anticipate that he expected to get as intimately involved with the Albany movement as he did.
Dr. Anderson got carried away and in public asked Martin to demonstrate, to lead the march with them, and he agreed. And then he got put in jail, and with no plan, no thought of what we were going to do.
King accepted release from jail. As he divided his time between Albany and other commitments, SNCC grew unhappy with SCLC's role.
When Dr. King would come in, we'd get 2,000 or 3,000 people without much effort, so that was in our favor. But when he left, it was more difficult for us to get people to come. So that this phenomena of Doc flying into places where we worked and then flying out to another place, which was needed, made it difficult for us to organize.
Well, in Albany, we were like firefighters. The fire was already burning, and I try to say this as charitably as I can. SNCC was in over its head, and they wanted the international and national attention that Martin Luther King's presence would generate, but they did not want the input of his organization.
I don't have but one speech. I don't have but one message as I journey around this country. And it is a message which says that I am convinced that the most potent weapon available to oppress people as they struggle for freedom and justice is the weapon of nonviolence. Amen.
As the movement took the nonviolent struggle into the streets of Albany, organizers expected the same reaction encountered in most Southern communities: police brutality.
All right, let's stop it right here.
But they had never met a law enforcement officer like this one, Albany's chief of police, Laurie Pridgett.
You're welcome to picket, but this grouping up here is going to stop. There'll be allowed 2 here in this block, and the others will move out. We'll allow 2 picketers in this block at your front of the city hall where you're picketing. You can leave 2 here, or you can go. The others that don't go and continue, you'll be arrested. Now let's have 2 in this area right here where you picket.
I did research. Found his method was nonviolence, that his method was to fill the jail, same as Gandhi in India. And once he filled the jails, we'd have no capacity to arrest, and then we'd have to give in to his demands.
Pritchett made sure his jails wouldn't fill up. He had planned carefully.
I had sat down and took a map and went 15 miles, how many jails was in a 15-mile radius, how many was in a 30-mile radius, on up to maybe 50, 60-mile radius. And I'd contacted those authorities. They'd assured us that we could use their facilities. And we had, when the mass arrest started, we'd have marches and there'd be 200, 300. At one time there, I think we had almost 2,000, but none in our jail.
You'll have to understand that going to jail was probably one of the most feared things in rural Georgia. There were many blacks who were arrested in small towns in Georgia, never to be heard from again. We have every reason to believe many of these were lynched. So going to jail was no small thing.
Dr. Steele, what are the conditions there? How is it crowded?
Yeah, very crowded.
How many is that cell supposed to hold?
They don't hold very many because we all sleeping on the floor and some of them.
Is that so? It's built to hold 10, and there are 69 in there. Uh-huh.
Because Chief Pritchett sent prisoners into these jails, some question how nonviolent he really was.
I think the apt description was slick. He did have enough intelligence to read Dr. King's book, and he culled from that a way to avoid the confrontation and inducing the great ferment in the national community by being non-brutal rather than being non-violent. It's bizarre to say that a segregationist system or a law enforcement official of a segregationist system could be nonviolent, because first of all, nonviolence works in a moral climate, and segregation is not a moral climate.
I remember a statement that Chief Pritchett made to me one time when he says, you know, Sherrod, it's just a matter of mind over matter. I don't mind, and you don't matter.
Against the solid resistance of city officials, the Albany movement found strength in mass meetings and song.
Most of the mass meeting was singing in Albany. There was more singing than was talking. And so most of the work that was done in terms of taking care of movement business had to do with nurturing the people who had come. And there would be 2 or 3 people who would talk, but basically songs was the bed of everything.
July 1962. Dr. King and Reverend Ralph Abernathy began serving a 45-day sentence. They were determined to stay in jail to protest Albany segregation. But 3 days later, they were released. A stunned Dr. King explained that someone had mysteriously paid their fines.
At which time the chief said to us that we had been released. In other words, that our fine had been paid. I said, well, Chief, we want to serve this time. His only response then was, God knows, Reverend, I don't want you in my jail.
I knew that if he stayed in jail, we'd continue to have problems. So I talked to some people. I said, we've got to get him out. And once we do, I think he'll leave here. And arrangements were made. Frankly, I don't know who the man was that paid the bond.
But it was done at your request?
Yes, it was done at my request. And it sort of surprised Dr. King. This is one time, only time I've ever seen him when he seemed, way he didn't know which way to go.
All right, let's go. Smiling for the birdie, look at it.
In late July, the Albany movement received another setback. At the city's request, federal Judge J. Robert Elliott issued a restraining order to end the demonstrations which had been going on for almost 9 months.
When the federal court started ruling against us, that created a whole different thing in terms of what strategy do you use now. Because up to that point, Martin had been willing to break state laws that were unjust laws, and our ally was the federal judiciary. And so if we would take our case to the federal court and the federal court ruled against us, what recourse did we have?
Frustrated by the federal court action, Dr. King called for President Kennedy to intervene, but Kennedy remained distant.
The president had decided that he was going to delegate the civil rights matter to the Attorney General, and that was going to be a primary area of responsibility for the Attorney General. And the president was going to spend his time dealing with other parts of it, the administration policy, and especially, of course, foreign affairs.
The United States government is involved in sitting down at Geneva with the Soviet Union. I can't understand why the government of Albany, the City Council of Albany, cannot do the same for American citizens.
By August, Dr. King realized there would be no clear-cut victories in Albany. He was depressed as he left the city. Albany remained as segregated as it was the previous December when he first arrived.
I'm under orders to keep walking.
The Albany movement continued without him.
Don't get weary. Endure to the end. What does the Bible say about it? The victory is not to the swift or to the strong, but to him who holdeth out to the end. We got to hold out.
Now, I can't help how Dr. King might have felt, or Wyatt T. might have felt, or Bernard Lee, or any of the rest of them in SCLC, NAACP, or CORE, any other groups were felt. But as far as we were concerned, things moved on. We didn't skip one beat.
The ministers of SCLC left Albany, but they took with them some important lessons that defined movement strategy for Birmingham.
The strengths of the Albany movement was it was perhaps the first time in this period of struggle of black people that we had mobilized an entire community against segregation. And secondly, we learned that valid and crucial lesson that you must pinpoint your targets so that you do not dilute the strength of your attack.
Coming out of Albany, which was what many people consider not a victory, they needed a victory. Dr. King's image at this time was slightly on the wane because he had not projected. I say, I assure you, if you come to Birmingham, this movement can not only gain prestige, but really shake the country.
SCLC's leaders accepted this challenge. They arrived in Birmingham in the midst of a campaign to replace Bull Connor and the other commissioners with a new form of government.
I'm pleased to have a cloud removed so the people of the city can get down to the very serious business of securing the very best men possible to man the new city government.
Regardless of what form of government we have, it is important that we put in office men who have records which show that they are not owned or controlled by anybody or by any group.
Bull Connor tried to keep power by running for mayor. But on April 2nd, 1963, he lost to Albert Boutwell, a racial moderate. The next day, SCLC launched Project C, C for confrontation.
Learning by the Albany circumstance, I targeted 3 stores. Pizitz was one, I don't recall the other 2 stores now. And since the 16th Street Baptist Church was going to be our headquarters, I had it timed as to how long it took a youngster to walk down there, how long it would take an older person to walk down there, how long it would take a middle-aged person to walk down there. And I picked out what would be the best routes. Under some subterfuge, I visited all 3 of these stores and counted the stools, the tables, the chairs, etc., and what the best method of ingress and egress was.
Yes, we want a freedom. Yes, we want a freedom, children. Yes, we want a freedom. We want to have freedom and we want it now. Yes, we want a freedom. Yes, we want a freedom, children.
21 demonstrators were arrested on the first day of protest. And the city of Birmingham discovered it had another problem. The outgoing commissioners announced that they had no intention of stepping aside for the newly elected government.
Well, I remember now the day we swore in the mayor, and before the day was over, we discovered we had 2 mayors, 2 city governments, and Dr. Martin Luther King and the SCLC starting marches up and down the street. The marches occurred almost entirely during the 37-day period when Birmingham had 2 governments. On Tuesdays, the commission met, proceeded to govern the city, and when they finished, they would march out and 9 council members would march in, and they would proceed to adopt laws and spend money and conduct the affairs of the city.
Until the courts could decide which city government was the legal one, Bull Connor remained in charge of the police and fire departments. And Connor took a lesson from Laurie Pritchett, showing restraint as he supervised the arrest of hundreds of demonstrators.
Oh, Lord, I'm riding.
It was a week and a half before Easter. As planned, the demonstrations affected business during a major shopping season. Merchants and community leaders were upset.
We've got some mighty good people in this community, both white and colored.
Businessman A.G. Gaston supported the new administration.
We didn't anticipate the need for Martin King at that time. This Martin King thing came, and all of a sudden.
I was upset with Dr. King because he wouldn't give us a chance to prove what we could do through the political processes. And a year and a day after Connor had been elected with the largest vote in history, a majority of the people of this city voted to terminate his office. And when we ran for mayor, they rejected him.
I believe a representative of my office at the Department of Justice.
The federal government also thought the protests were ill-timed.
Birmingham, the fact that there was a change in administration in Birmingham, that the new administration had not yet taken over in their responsibilities and their duties, and that perhaps the timing of these demonstrations could be reconsidered.
On April 10th, Birmingham obtained a state court injunction ordering an end to the demonstrations. Dr. King grew discouraged, worried that the campaign here, as in Albany, would stall.
We had about 500 or 600 people in jail, but all of the money was gone and we couldn't get people out of jail. And the business community, black business community, and some of the white clergy were pressuring us to call off the demonstrations and just get out of town. We didn't know what to do. And he sat there in room 30 in the Gaston Motel, and Martin didn't say anything. And then finally, he got up and he went in the bedroom, and he came back with his blue jeans on and his jacket, and he said, look, he said, I don't know what to do. He said, I just know that something has got to change in Birmingham. I don't know whether I can raise money to get people out of jail. I do know that I can go into jail with them. And not knowing how it was going to work out, he walked out of the room and led a demonstration and went to jail. That was, I think, the beginning of his true leadership.
this time, local white clergy were criticizing King and the campaign.
The ministers published in the newspapers a diatribe against Martin, calling him a troublemaker and saying that he was there stirring up trouble to get publicity. And he sat down and took that newspaper, and he had no paper, and he was in solitary confinement. And he started writing an answer to that one-page ad around the margins of the New York Times.
I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied.
As King sat in Birmingham jail, the demonstrations lost supporters. 8 days after his arrest, King accepted release on bond to plan the next phase of Project C. It would be the most controversial move yet.
We wanted to get the black community in Birmingham involved, and the way you get people involved is get their children involved.
They were taking the kids out of school, you know, marching. And I thought that was unnecessary. In fact, my idea was the kids, many of them didn't know what it was all about to start with.
Most adults have bills to pay, house notes, rents, car notes, utility bills, but the young people, wherein they can think at the same level, are not at this point hooked with all those responsibilities. So a boy from high school, he get the same effect in terms of being in jail, in terms of putting pressure on the city as his father, and yet he's not, there's no economic threat on the family because the father's still on the job.
I'm on my way to freedom land.
Thursday, May 2nd was D-Day, the day the children began to march in Birmingham. At first, the groups were small. Policemen arrested them, loaded them in paddy wagons, and took them away to Birmingham jail. As the children continued to march in increasing numbers, paddy wagons became inadequate. Finally, school buses were brought in to gather the demonstrators.
If my mother don't go, I'll go anyhow. If my mother don't go, I'll go anyhow. If my mother don't go, I'll go anyhow. I'm on my way, oh Lord, freedom land. There is nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to turn me around. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to turn me around.
By the end of that Thursday, 700 children were taken to Birmingham jail.
I'm on my way, oh Lord, freedom land.
Friday, more than 1,000 children stayed out of school and arrived at the 16th Street Church to march. Bull Connor tried to stop the marches before they began and brought out the city's police dogs. Next, the fire department was brought in, and Bull Connor ordered water hoses turned on the demonstrators. With 100 pounds of pressure per square inch, the water hit with enough force to knock the bark off trees. As water pounded the demonstrators, David Vann was on the phone with A.G. Gaston.
And he was expressing a great deal of resentment about King coming in and messing up the thing just when we were getting a new start. And then he said to me, he said, but Lawyer Vann said, they've turned fire hoses on a little black girl. They're rolling that little girl right in the middle of the street now. I can't talk to you no more.
It was it, and stand up on my building looking down on Bull Connor and them shooting water in the park right across from my office there in that park. I guess that's the most outstanding thing in my mind right now. I just couldn't imagine what could happen.
Bull Connor's white tank patrolled the city streets as the fire hoses stopped the demonstrators. Some hid behind the trees of Kelly England Park. Others frolicked in defiance. The conflict gained national attention, and news coverage of the event shocked the American public.
And it was a masterpiece of the use of media to explain a cause to the general public of a nation. Because in those days you had 15 minutes of national news and 15 minutes of local news. And in marching only one block, they could get enough news film to fill all of the newscasts of all of the television stations of the United States.
Photographs appeared in newspapers throughout the world, and the Birmingham story was told in many languages. The Russian newspaper Pravda ran a cartoon of police intimidating a black child. The federal government worried about America's image in other parts of the world. Governor Wallace saw it differently.
It seems that other parts of the world ought to be concerned about what we think of them instead of what they think of us. After all, we're feeding most of them, and whenever they start rejecting 25 cents of each dollar foreign aid money that we send to them, then I'll be concerned about their attitude toward us. But until they reject that 25 cents out of each dollar that Southern taxpayers pay for foreign aid to these countries, I will never be concerned about their attitude. In the first place, the average man in Africa and Asia doesn't even know where he is, much less where Alabama is.
On Saturday, the dogs and water hoses provoked angry responses from bystanders, some of them carrying weapons. Seeing the beginnings of violence, James Bevel borrowed a bullhorn from a nearby policeman.
So I took the bullhorn and said, okay, get off the streets now. We're not going to have violence. If you're not going to respect policemen, you're not going to be in the movement, and, you know. So it's strange, I guess, to them. I'm with the police talking through the bullhorn and giving orders, and everybody was obeying the orders. It was like, it was wow. But what was at stake was the possibility of a riot, and that once in a movement, once a riot breaks out, you have to stop. It takes you 4 or 5 more days to get re-established, and I was trying to avoid that kind of situation.
Monday, the 5th day of the children's campaign. Comedian Dick Gregory arrived in Birmingham and marched with the young demonstrators. Like hundreds before him, he was arrested. Law enforcement officials were working overtime to keep up with the arrest.
There was no such thing as off days. Everybody working 7 days, sleeping, catnapping, and just holding fire. We all had the confirmed belief that this couldn't go on for long because he was pressing the issue to the wall.
The confrontation moved outside the park. Once again, Bull Connor summoned his firemen. With no place to run, no trees for protection, the demonstrators were hit with the full force of the water. By Monday night, 2,500 demonstrators had been arrested, over 2,000 of them children. All jails in the city and county were filled.
At one time, I had, here in this building on the 7th and 8th floor, we had over 1,200 male juveniles, black, on top of our regular complement of probably near 1,000. At the same time, I had 600 female juveniles in the 4-H dormitory at the fairground.
Meanwhile, the Justice Department tried to move negotiations forward.
I participated in all of in order to try to get some kind of agreement between people that often wouldn't talk to each other at all. I don't mean that the blacks wouldn't talk to anybody, but I mean there were many whites that wouldn't talk to any blacks, and there were many more whites that wouldn't talk to certain blacks, and there were no whites, I think, except for David Vann, who would talk to Martin King.
Tuesday, May 7th. Fighting broke out between blacks and whites in the downtown area. Burke Marshall and the business leaders had just left the negotiating table for lunch. The situation was fast reaching the riot proportions James Bevel had feared. The businessmen quickly returned to negotiations, ready to talk.
And so we began analyzing, what are your problems, what are our problems? You got to recognize, one, that we don't have a government. We've got two governments, neither of them can be effective. We've got to find a way to work this thing out within private sector formats.
Both sides agreed to a day of truce. A resolution was reached, but there was a last-minute hitch.
After we reached the settlement, and it looks like a molehill today to say that we're going to take down the signs, we have a 60-day cooling off period and desegregate lunch counters and begin a program of employment in downtown Birmingham with at least 3 clerks hired. I think somebody in New York asked Reverend Shuttlesworth why he would settle for just 3 clerks in downtown Birmingham, and he said, I meant 3 in every store. And the thing almost came unglued.
By that time, Reverend Shuttlesworth was so worked up that I can remember Fred cussing and David Vann crying. And it just seemed like when David Vann wanted to settle, Fred wasn't ready to settle.
Well, you must remember that there's always some disagreement when it looks as if you're not getting what you're aiming at. And there are people who want victories, social victories, to come quickly.
On Friday, May 10th, 38 days after Project C began, an agreement was reached with the business community. Reverend Shuttlesworth had been right. When the movement came to Birmingham, it won a much-needed victory, and it gained national attention. The next night, the Ku Klux Klan met outside the city, and Grand Dragon Robert Shelton gave this opinion of the Birmingham Agreement.
No business people in Birmingham or any other city has the authority to attempt any type of negotiation when it deals in governmental affairs of a municipality. Martin Luther King, in my opinion, epitaph can be written here in Birmingham.
Several hours later, a bomb exploded outside Martin Luther King's room at the Gaston Motel. King had already left Birmingham, and no one was in the room at the time. As a large crowd gathered, the Alabama State Police moved in and began beating blacks with clubs and rifles. In response, angry blacks rioted and set fire to several buildings. Over the next few weeks, the riots that began in Birmingham spread to other cities. Racial tensions gripped the country, and President Kennedy was moved to action. On June 11th, he took a stronger position than any president since Lincoln, calling civil rights a moral issue.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
Kennedy pushed for a new civil rights bill, but was troubled when the movement announced plans for a mass march on Washington. Fearing more violence, Attorney General Robert Kennedy had tried to prevent the march without success.
There will be a mass march. There is no doubt about that. And it is our purpose and it is our hope that this march will carry on in a manner that will be definitely and effectively in support of the civil rights program.
Freedom Now movement, hear me. We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington.
The movement that had learned to mobilize communities now set about trying to mobilize a nation. Across the country, people made plans to attend the March on Washington, demonstrating for jobs and freedom. Among the thousands who traveled to Washington, there were black and white activists, labor leaders, clergy, and Hollywood stars.
They came from every state. They came in jalopies, on trains, buses, anything they could get. Some walked.
Bayard Rustin was the master organizer behind the day's events, coordinating hundreds of details. Volunteers painted signs to state the issues. They made 80,000 cheese sandwiches to feed the marchers. Security was carefully set up so violence would not mar the day. As the day began, march organizers worried that the turnout would not be large enough to attract the nation's attention. By early afternoon, more than 200,000 people gathered for the symbolic march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. It was a triumphant day for Mr. Randolph, who had first proposed the idea for such a march in 1941 during Franklin Roosevelt's administration. But there was trouble behind the scenes as the marchers gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. The White House was upset about a speech that was to be given by John Lewis, National Chairman for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
In the first part of the speech, John said something like, we cannot support the proposed bill being introduced or being presented by President Kennedy, for it was too little and too late.
And John's speech was the only speech at the March on Washington that criticized the Kennedy administration for lack of civil rights enforcement because the SNCC people were being brutalized in the South. Bayard asked us to change the speech, and we told him that we weren't going to change the speech, and that he'd have to do it over our dead bodies. We weren't going to change it. Then he went down in the crowd and got A. Philip Randolph.
Lewis was to be speaker number 6 on the program. The opening speeches were already underway and the conflict remained unsolved. A. Philip Randolph finally made a personal appeal to the young men from SNCC.
He was 75, and here we were, 1/3 his age, and, he was asking us to do this for him. He said, I waited all my life for this opportunity. Please don't ruin it. And we felt that for him that we had to make some concessions.
So the three of us, John Lewis, Cortland Cox, and myself, we huddled and sat together, and the rewriting took place at the Lincoln Memorial, and and it was done out of a spirit of unity. We wanted the March on Washington to go forward, and we wanted the SNCC's participation to be very visible, and we certainly weren't interested in withdrawing from the March on Washington.
If we do not get meaningful legislation out of this Congress, the time will come when we will not confine our marching to Washington. We will march through the South, through the streets of Jackson, through the streets of Danville, through the streets of Cambridge, through the streets of Birmingham. How long can we be patient? We want our freedom, and we want it now.
The disagreement over this speech was contained so well, few people knew of the problem. The speech that captured the nation's attention was the stirring oratory of Martin Luther King.
So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring in windy caverns. When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Only 1 year after the doubts and despair of Albany, Georgia, Martin Luther King had triumphed. Much of the nation now saw him as the leader of the movement. In the White House, President Kennedy saw the march as support for passage of his Civil Rights Bill. That evening, Reverend Ralph Abernathy returned to the Lincoln Memorial.
Where 250,000 people had sat that day. There was nothing but the wind blowing the leftover programs and scattered litter across the way, across the reflection pool. The wind was moving and blowing and blowing and keeping music. And we were so proud of the fact that no violence had taken place that day, and we were so pleased. But this beautiful scene of the wind dancing in the sands of the Lincoln Memorial, I will never forget. This was the greatest day of my life.
18 days after the March on Washington, Birmingham, Alabama, a bomb exploded in the 16th Street Baptist Church just before a Sunday morning service. 15 people were injured. 4 children were killed. The murder of these children shook the nonviolent movement to its core. As the people buried their dead, they sang, "We shall overcome." But in anger and in rage, many wondered how.
God is on our side.
God is on our side. God is on our side. God is on our side today. Oh, deep in my heart, know that I do believe. Oh, we shall overcome someday.
We'll walk hand in hand.
We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday.
Eyes on the Prize was produced by Blackside Incorporated, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, public television stations, the Ford Foundation, General Electric. At GE, we're in the business of trying to make life a little easier, a little better. At GE, we bring good things to life. Lotus Development Corporation, software that's changed the way people do business. The Charles H. Revson Foundation, and the Lilly Endowment Incorporated. Additional funding was provided by the Boston Foundation, Cummins Engine Company Incorporated, the Raytheon Company, the San Francisco Foundation, and by the following.
This is PBS.